Okay, for section 3 of chapter 1, we're going to look closer at what is the economic approach. And basically, it has to do with systematic decision making. So, to begin, we'll talk about how economists make the assumption that individuals act as if they are motivated by self interest, and therefore they respond predictably to opportunities for gain. And this is one of the most fundamental assumptions in economics, is that we behave rationally. And we'll talk about what that rationality assumption is in a second. But it's hard. It's a hard thing to challenge that assumption. In fact, I challenge you to try to think of any situation in which a person does not act out of self-interest. Now, I will say that we need to be careful here, because self-interest is not the same thing as selfishness. Lots of people do lots of things that are not selfish, right? People give to charity. People give money to homeless people. We do things for our friends and family members. But nevertheless, when we do these things, we are still doing so in a self-interested manner. We do them basically because they make us feel good. And that's self-interest. That's a self-interested behavior. So don't confuse self-interest with selfishness, okay? They're not the same thing. And this guy, Adam Smith, who is the grandfather of economics, he was not an economist during his time. There was no such thing as economics. He gave birth to it. And he did so by writing a book called The Wealth of Nations, or the long title, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. But he was keenly aware of this self-interested behavior in human beings. And in fact, he illustrated it with one passage in his book. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard of their own self-interest, to their own self-interest. So, again, it's not out of the kindness of Kroger that they provide food, a place for us to buy food. It's because Kroger, as a company, has a self-interest to earn profits, and they do that by selling groceries, right? So they're not doing it just because they want to be a good company, or out of the goodness of their heart, because they care about us. They do it to make money, right? So that's basically what this quote is saying, right? Now, a part of this self-interested behavior comes the rationality assumption. So this is probably the most fundamental assumption in economics. And it basically says that, or it's the assumption that people do not intentionally make themselves worse off with the decisions that they make. Now, some of you might be thinking of certain decisions that people make and thinking to yourself, well, that really doesn't seem like a decision that benefits them. Well, there could be two things going on. It could be something that's unintentional, or it's something that they themselves believe is beneficial to them. So I'll give you one example that's pretty stark. Suicide. Right? Most of us would look at someone who decides to commit suicide and think, well, that was clearly a decision that did not make them better off. But you have to sort of put yourself in that person's shoes. And if you are able to do that, you realize that, well, the reason they commit suicide is because they believe they are going to be better off dead. So I challenge you to try to think of some other situations where it might not obviously be rational, but then to think about it, try to think about it a little deeper, and see if you can find where the rationality in that decision comes through. Okay. Now, this example of suicide, in fact, brings up a good question. Does the fact that some people apparently make irrational choices, does that invalidate the rationality assumption in economics? And hopefully I just illustrated to you why the answer is essentially no. Basically, if people believe they're making a decision that is going to make them better off, then it is a rational decision, even though it might not seem that way to the rest of us in society, from a social norm standpoint, right? Another question this sort of brings up is, can the economic models that we are going to build be applied to situations in which behavior is at odds with what we expect from rational people? In a lot of instances, the answer is no, especially with some of the older, more basic economic models, most of which we will learn. But that is actually part of what is going on in economics today, is the development of new models that can predict people's behavior, can predict behavior that doesn't seem to correspond or align with some of the older economic models. So we'll talk about that more as the course goes on, especially with some behavioral economic examples. Now, going along with this self-interested rational behavior assumption, we have to talk about incentives, right? People respond to incentives, and I mentioned this. I mentioned incentives earlier in section 1, I believe. So let's talk about incentives in a little bit more detail. So there are basically two types of incentives: positive incentives and negative incentives. And positive incentives are your rewards in life, incentives that reward a particular type of behavior, right? So earlier I mentioned grades, improving your knowledge and intelligence, working towards a degree that will help you earn more money in your job. These are all positive incentives. Negative incentives, on the other hand, are punishments. So speeding tickets, parking tickets, taxes, right? Cigarette taxes, gas taxes. What else? Jail time, right? All these things that are basically punishments. These are examples of negative incentives. Now, as I mentioned in an earlier video as well, basically every single choice involves balancing costs and benefits, right? Because while a grade in this class might be a positive incentive for you, it's a reward, it's something that benefits you. It's not free, right? It comes at the cost of your time and your effort studying for assignments, for quizzes and exams. So at the end of the term, whatever grade you are able to obtain basically reflects you balancing the benefits of a higher grade against the cost of earning a higher grade in terms of increased effort and time studying, right? So basically, it will be the result of an equilibrium, a balancing of those costs and benefits. And that happens pretty much in every single economic decision that you can ever consider. So here's some other examples of positive and negative incentives. So some positive incentives: school children getting gold stars for good behavior. I can relate to this directly. This was an incentive scheme that my 5th grade teacher used. Another example is working to have a better life for yourself. Hopefully we can all relate to that. And then as far as negative incentives, any type of penalty, punishment, overdraft fees, those sorts of things, right? I encourage you to take a few minutes, maybe pause the video and try to think of some other types, some other examples of these two types of incentives. And speaking of incentives, here's an interesting international policy example involving Greece. So in recent history, Greece has gradually increased their tax rates in an attempt to collect more tax revenue, because there's they have a lot of debt that they need to pay off, and they also have a lot of public goods that they need to pay for. So they were, in an attempt to increase tax revenue, they increased tax rates. As it turned out, they discovered that they actually ended up bringing in less tax revenue after the increases in tax rates. And after some investigation, some economists discovered that what people were doing was they were responding to the higher tax rates by trying harder to avoid paying taxes, to evade paying taxes. And this is actually something that may be illustrated to some degree in something called the Laffer curve, which if you're in the macroeconomics class, you will learn about later in the semester, later in the term. All right, and to wrap up this section on the economic approach of systematic decision-making, let's make sure that very, very lastly, we understand the definition of self-interest. So this shouldn't be too hard. We're definitely, for the most part, I can't think of anybody that isn't this way, but we are all basically driven by self-interest, right? And this is basically the pursuit of one's goals, whether it be prestige, friendship, love. And you might be thinking, oh, this is interesting. The reason these examples are given is to sort of illustrate the point that not everything in life is about money, right? These things don't really involve, well, prestige may, but friendship and love don't necessarily involve money, right? They say you can't buy love, but in any case, right, self-interest is not always about money. So just keep that in mind, but it is about making ourselves better off, whatever we perceive that to be, right? So that's another interesting point about self-interest here, is that it's basically subjective. What I believe is good for myself, maybe my parents don't believe it's good for me, right? So from their perspective, they may see that as irrational behavior, but because I believe it makes me better off, it basically is rational behavior, right? Rational self-interested behavior. All right, so that concludes the video for section 3 of chapter 1. I'll see you in the next video for section 4.